wonder what's hot in the baking world right now? It's not even that complicated. You get store-bought croissants, cut them open, shove in some store-bought cookie dough, and that's it. Hi everyone, I'm Gemma Stafford, professional chef, cookbook author, and creator of Bigger Bolder Baking. Welcome to Need to Know, your go-to podcast for everything baking entertainment. From the latest trends,
this is the viral scrambled pancake trend.
What? To the tips and tricks you crave.
We discovered that if you take apple peels, toss them in a little cinnamon and sugar, and bake them for about an hour in the oven, you get a really lovely treat.
Plus exclusive interviews with baking pros.
Hey, it's Liz from the Sugar Geek Show. Thanks for having me, Gemma.
We've even got the Bold Baking Hotline to answer all of your baking queries and questions.
Is a Dutch oven really necessary for baking bread, and what difference does it make?
Yes, I think we probably would agree on that, do we, Oni?
Yeah, oh, good. So join us every Sunday for your new weekly baking ritual. It's everything you need to know.
This episode is brought to you by Wisconsin Cheese. We've been making cheese in Wisconsin since before we were even a state, which may be one reason why we win so many awards for it. It's what happens when a whole state dreams in cheese. Find your next favorite cheese at wisconsincheese.com.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
This is What Doesn't Kill You, Food Industry Insights. I'm your host, Katie Keeper. My guest today is the excellent Dr. Thomas Boving, the chair of the Department of Geosciences at the University of Rhode Island, and my new best friend. Tom,
Hi, everybody.
Tom, thank you so much for joining us today. I will preface this by saying that Tom was on, believe it or not, I have another radio show. And he was on my other radio show to talk about the geology of Rhode Island, among other things. But of course, we talked about my favorite topic, which is water. For those of you who listen regularly, you know that I've done basically a year's worth of shows about our water supplies in the United States, both our drinking water, our standing water, our rivers, our streams, and most importantly, the waters that are being polluted either by agrochemicals, or today we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk a little bit about PFAS, or forever chemicals, and Tom is going to remind us of how exactly we say those what PFAS
Alkylated substances. Yes, it's quite a mouthful. That's why we use PFAS short, so perfluoroalkylated substances.
Thank you. I love that. So before we get going on the whole PFAS issue, first of all, tell us a little bit about your field and what your particular focuses of research have been, because you travel a lot. You do a lot of work here in the States, but you do a lot of work in water-challenged countries around the world. So let's get a little thumbnail of a day in the life of Tom Boving.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for having me. And I'm a hydrogeologist, so I am studying water. I do research on the occurrence of water, and mostly groundwater I'm talking about, mostly groundwater, but certainly surface water, because I tell my students all the time, the two are connected, surface water and groundwater, part of the same system, part of the hydrologic system.
Sure.
So when I say groundwater, bear with me, I usually also have surface water in mind. So I look at groundwater in terms of quality and quantity. Mm-hmm. Where is the groundwater? How much can we expect if we start pumping? And then do we extract? Is there the potential for depleting this very valuable natural resource? So there's that, the quantity issue. And then there's the quality issue.
Right.
Because much of our groundwater these days is impacted by human activities and also climate change. That's another factor that we're considering in our research.
Sure.
Where if you live in coastal areas, you may notice the salt concentration in your water going up, and that can be linked to several processes. So we're studying water both in the quality, from the quality perspective and the quantity perspective. And that's what I'm doing here at the University of Rhode Island.
Right. Fantastic. And you travel a lot. I know you've done a lot of work in India. I know that you've been to Jordan. Like, what is your focus there kind of similar to what you're doing here?
Yes and no. I mean, let's take India, for example. India is a country with a massive population, an emerging economy. So there are issues that here in the US we have long since forgotten, I would say, like the fact that wastewater here in the US is treated in most cases. We have very excellent technologies for wastewater treatment, for collecting wastewater in the first place, for drinking water treatment. And in India, that's not the case. Large parts of India are not hooked up to wastewater treatment plants. And in big cities, wastewater enters major rivers completely untreated. I mean, that's just the bottom line. So sometimes I feel reminded of where we have been here in the US 50 years ago, or maybe even 60 years ago, or Europe for that matter. And many places in the world are just catching up. And the problems that we made 50, 60 years ago are being replicated, maybe even in an order or two orders more than what we have done here. So it's very interesting in that way. But it's also providing a path forward for the future, because we can take what we learned here in the US and transplant it into the context of countries like India.
Right. So to bring us back to the United States, and that is really interesting, because like I noticed, I was in Cuba last winter, and we were hoping to swim in this beautiful bay in front of the apartment we had rented, or the little B&B we were staying in. And the woman who owned the place, she was like, "Oh no, you're not doing that." Why? We said, because their wastewater is not treated, and it was going right into that beautiful body of water right in front of us. Because the Cuban government has no money for infrastructure projects like the ones they need for that. But anyway.
And again, this is a worldwide phenomenon, and there's no judgment here. It's just that building this infrastructure, it's very expensive and requires decades. So that's basically what it means, developing country, developing in the sense that a lot of work needs to get done.
Right, before they can achieve the level that we've achieved in
the
US, in Western Europe. Yeah.
Yes.
Right. So now your recent work has focused to some extent on studying how to best mitigate PFAS contamination. Now, all of a sudden, and I don't mean all of a sudden, but I'd say in the last 18 months, maybe 2 years, the PFAS contamination of our waterways has become an ever greater newspaper headline, right?
Correct.
So how are we doing? Like, I know, for instance, in my own state of Rhode Island, as you know perfectly well, Tom, they have instituted some quite strict new laws about identifying PFAS contamination and also mitigating and removing it. So let's first talk about how are we doing as a nation? Like in the United States, Rhode Island is obviously, this is very top of mind here. What about other states in the United States?
Yeah, right. So you're absolutely right. PFAS has been on many people's minds for 2 years, and I'm talking in general public. If you talk to scientists, we have been looking at PFAS almost for 2 decades, maybe even actually longer. But maybe I should start with why PFAS is only emerging now as a talking point for the broader public. It has to do with the fact that it's extremely difficult to find these compounds in the first place, meaning historically we didn't have the analytical tools widely available to test for PFAS. So PFAS have been used since the 40s and really since the 70s at large scale. So plenty of time for the PFAS to get spread around the environment, but only in the late 90s, early 2000s, started scientists to pick up PFAS on a regular basis. And it took many years to put the picture together, and we are now finally at a point where we can say that PFAS almost everywhere. In almost every person's body, in every person's blood, everywhere from equatorial areas to the remote areas of the South Pole or the Arctic, so everywhere. And that has to do with the fact that PFAS are so incredibly stable. They just don't break down. And once in the environment, they remain in the environment. And that's why people refer to them as forever chemicals.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. So I have to ask why it took so long for them to start thinking about, like, what rang the, I guess my question is, what rang the alarm bell? Why was it that this ubiquitous chemical, which is used, as you know, my listeners definitely know, it is used in a huge variety of applications, military applications, firefighting, industrial applications, your Teflon, your rain gear. You know, I mean, it's really almost impossible to find a product that does not have some level of one of these chemicals in it. Isn't that true, Tom?
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, PFAS are very common, also very useful. I mean,
very useful.
Yeah, it's not like, if you talk to firefighters, how effective these firefighting foams are in extinguishing burning gasoline, they will all tell you that this is a really great product. Or if you ever use the Teflon pan, you know how easy it is to clean it, and so on and so on. And Gore-Tex keeps you dry from the rain, and so many products, right? So yeah, the bottom line is, like I had mentioned earlier, that it took the scientific community so much time to find out where are these compounds, and more important, what is the health effect?
Right.
Are they critically, are they toxic? At what levels? And these are studies that just require years and years to stand up to scrutiny, because we're talking, on the one hand side, the general public, which has an interest in having access to clean water, and then on the other side, industry, which has an interest in selling us products that make our life easier. So we need to be finding we have to have data which speaks to the benefit or to the detriment of using PFAS.
Right.
And we are now, after so many decades, at a point where we have a clear picture evolving that PFAS, even at very, very low concentrations, are harmful to human health and the environment in general.
Mm-hmm.
And this has now bubbled up to the surface. In fact, EPA this year has released the first national primary drinking water regulations,
right,
which is basically a law that puts stringent limits on how much of certain PFAS is permissible in our waters.
Mm-hmm. And even those levels are not necessarily adopted as a federal, like some states have adopted much more stringent regulations than the federal government has. Isn't that true? Than the EPA has.
You're absolutely right. So some states have been at the forefront of this PFAS research and setting standards. Like California usually is the leader in that regards. Large state, a lot of support for research and whatnot. And then other states have defined their own limits. So, for example, in Rhode Island, we have currently an interim standard. It's called 2023, so a year actually ahead of the EPA standard, which is higher than EPA standard.
Yeah.
20 ppt, parts per trillion, that is, versus 4 ppt, which is the EPA standard.
Wow. Why the discrepancy?
Well, part of it is Rhode Island was ahead of the EPA, and many states have been more proactive than the EPA and have defined standards that, according to local conditions, were considered critical. So critical as a threshold for putting into local legislation. So Rhode Island, a year ahead, decided to go with 20 ppt. EPA is now at 4 ppt. Now, what that means is that the EPA standards supersede the state standards. So a state can define more stringent criteria, but cannot have looser criteria than the government standards. So,
of course,
I would say RI, the ball is now in the court of RI. they have to revise their interim standards and basically adjust them to the EPA standards. And that's probably already in progress. I'm not involved in this progress. And many states are the same. Some states, like I said, have even more stringent standards, meaning they're good, they don't have to do anything else.
Right. So why would we be revising our standards down to 4 parts per trillion? Because the EPA says that? But that if the state decided, I mean, I don't want to get bogged down in this, but if the state decided that 20 parts per trillion was enough to, set off an alarm bell and say, well, I don't want anything more than that going into my drinking water supplies, why would we reduce that standard? Because the EPA has found that it's safe?
In this case, lower is better.
I see.
So 20 PPT in Rhode Island, 4 PPT.
Oh, I'm understanding. I'm sorry. Okay, I misunderstood. Okay.
No. It's very confusing. I mean, this, even wrapping your head around these measurements, PPT, what does that mean? Parts per trillion. I mean,
right. I can't even count that many zeros, I'm afraid. I'm terribly math challenged here. But let's. I want to say one more thing and that is another application, because you mentioned Gore-Tex, and I realized that my beloved had a heart aortic valve replaced with Gore-Tex.
Yeah.
So I mean, this is also in literally they're using it in medical devices.
Oh, absolutely.
So that can't be really that good for you. I mean, anyway.
Well,
it's better than having a heart attack, no doubt about that.
Yeah, exactly, right? So,
I guess that's your trade-off.
Absolutely. And the latest research, there's some contradictory lines of evidence. Like, how long do you have to be exposed to these PFAS? And more important, what kind of PFAS you are exposed to? PFAS is a large group of chemicals,
thousands.
And maybe even as many as tens of thousands. Nobody really knows. And some of them are more toxic than others. Some we can probably tolerate in the human body, or it moves right through the human bodies. Others accumulate. And again, this is all emerging information that we collecting, I should say EPA is collecting, or the states are collecting, and they're looking very critically at the data, and then they make a recommendation. And if enough evidence is in existence that EPA, in this case, feels comfortable in defining standards for PPT, then they put that into law, and that's it. And it's plausible that in the future, these numbers change, can go up, can go down.
Sure, I understand that as research emerges naturally. So we are in a process of identifying PFAS. They have selected 6 out of a category of thousands of these chemicals as the ones that they really want to regulate.
Mm-hmm.
I guess those are the ones that are most widely used.
Correct.
Is the contamination, would you say, is it more prevalent in soil? Is it more prevalent in water? Is it about equal?
Yeah. Okay, so think about it this way. PFAS used at the surface, let's say firefighting foam, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's sprayed on the surface, and in the past, the fire is done, and the firefighters went home, job done. Now the PFAS is in the topsoil.
Right.
Now it starts raining. Or even the water that was used during firefighting training, whatever reasons, the PFAS in the soil are now moving down deeper into the subsurface.
Right.
We call the upper layer of Earth in terms of hydrology code, hydrology language, we call it the unsaturated zone or vadose zone. And that is the connector zone that connects the surface, the atmosphere, the surface, to the groundwater beneath. Mm-hmm. Meaning whatever PFAS end up in the groundwater had to move through the soil.
Right.
And during that passage, some PFAS are readily water soluble and they basically have no problem entering the groundwater. Other PFAS with other chemical characteristics get stuck, at least temporarily, in the soil. So to answer your question, because there's so many different PFAS, some make it in the groundwater fairly rapidly, some are stuck in the soil. So in other words, the highest concentration you find where the PFAS have been released, let's say the former fire training fire pit on an airport or wherever. And then from there, the water-soluble ones can easily spread with the moving groundwater. So you create a plume. We call this a plume, a groundwater contamination plume. And this plume doesn't know boundaries. So if there's a fence around the airport, the plume doesn't care. It goes right under and spreads, and can be, there are plumes that are several hundred yards, maybe even miles long.
Wow.
And once they reach a neighboring community where people rely on wells or whatever, people get exposed to PFAS from their groundwater. So long story short, PFAS are present both in the soil and in the groundwater.
Right. And more or less, I guess, in equal concentrations, depending on which class or which particular formulation of PFAS.
Yeah, I wouldn't go too far. So groundwater concentration can be very high.
Yeah.
In some instances, much higher than our limits. That's a bad situation, of course.
Yeah.
Or you can have soil right above where your well is, and you have no PFAS in there at all. And that speaks to the fact that these PFAS may travel with the water in the subsurface from a site far away where the soil concentrations are really, really high.
Got it.
To your property that never seen PFAS, and you still have PFAS in your groundwater.
Yikes. Oh my God. So what you guys, you guys, you scientists, you people. No, but so you have been working, with your cohort on technologies to try to remove these chemicals from our soil and our water. How is that effort going? Like what is the technology and what does it cost?
Well, excellent questions.
Thank you. I try.
No, I mean, first thing first, everything I'm talking about now is very expensive.
Mm-hmm.
Very expensive. Puts a big burden on those who have to treat water contaminated with PFAS, like our drinking water treatment plants and whatnot. So there are various strategies to tackle the problem. So besides avoiding contamination in the first place, that would be, of course, the goal.
Yeah, right.
Once it happens, we're talking about focus on the source zone. Where was the PFAS released? This is where you'll find the high soil concentrations, the highest groundwater concentrations. And by removing the zone of the source of the PFAS, you alleviate that problem to a large degree. Then you basically only have to deal with what's already migrated off the site and down gradient. Now, to treat soils contaminated with PFAS, you can do this in two ways. Either you dug it out, put it on a truck, and bring it to some treatment facility. We call this ex situ or outside area treatment. Or you treat the soils while they're still in place. It's called in situ treatment.
Okay.
And the in situ, the in-place treatment often is the only feasible way because PFAS may reside 100, 200 feet below the surface.
Mm-hmm.
So that would require a big hole to get even to the source of the PFAS. So what can you do? The PFAS are there. They're deep in the soil. We need to bring chemicals that destroy PFAS to where the PFAS reside. And one technique that we tested in my lab was injecting very, very strong oxidants. So compounds that rip these PFAS molecules apart with chemical reactions that are way too complicated to describe here in detail, but we're using some of the most powerful oxidants to destroy those PFAS right where they are sitting in the soil.
Right.
So we call this advanced oxidation processes. And another form is advanced reduction processes. Again, I'm not going into detail here, but these are in situ treatments. And that works quite well, but again, very expensive. And every contaminant site is different. So there's no silver bullet in a sense that once you develop a protocol for how to treat these PFAS, you can immediately take it from the one side to the next. So always more research needed to understand the hydrology, the geology, the architecture of the PFAS source zone, and so on and so on. Now, if I'm a water treatment plant operator, a drinking water treatment plant operator, I have different treatments at my disposal. And many treatment facilities rely on activated carbon.
Uh-huh.
Activated carbon is a very popular and very effective way to basically filter out PFAS that are coming in from the wells. Let's say a treatment plant obtains this water from a well field nearby. So the water comes through a pipeline to the drinking water facility, and it's then being flushed through tanks full with activated carbon. And the activated carbon binds the PFAS, removes it from the water to a large degree, and what comes out of the filter is treated water now free of PFAS. And by the way, this also works for metals and for many other contaminants.
Uh-huh.
So PFAS is just one. So I know many facilities that rely on activated carbon. At a household level or a larger, more technologically advanced drinking water treatment plants also use reverse osmosis or membranes to filter out the PFAS, or resins. So resins are basically specifically designed compounds that attract the PFAS and bind them to the resin. So these are all processes where we remove the PFAS, we don't destroy them. We remove them, we don't destroy them. That means the PFAS will enrich, concentrate in the activated carbon on the membranes or in the resins.
Yeah. And what do you do with it then? Because they don't break down, as you've already mentioned.
And now you increase the PFAS concentration from a few ppts, parts per trillion, to maybe orders of magnitude higher, because all the filters do exactly what they're designed for. Now you have very high concentration of PFAS in these filters. So yeah, you have to dispose of them. And you can't just dump them in some regular landfill, because they would be mobilized again over time.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So the way to get ultimately rid of them is by incineration.
Wow.
Incineration, basically bringing these concentrates to specially designed incinerators, garbage incinerators that, I mean, they're using temperatures way over 1,000, 2,000 degrees, and everything basically breaks down. The PFAS are ripped apart. But again, expensive, very expensive.
Right, right. We're going to take a short break right now for a sponsor drop. We'll be right back with Dr. Thomas Boving. We're talking about PFAS contamination here and around the world. Stay tuned for more.
This episode is brought to you by Wisconsin Cheese. There's a reason when you think of Wisconsin, you think cheese. Cheese is a huge part of Wisconsin's history and future. In Wisconsin, the state of cheese, the tradition of cheese-making excellence began 180 years ago, before Wisconsin was recognized as a state. Immigrants traveled to settle in this lush green hills of Wisconsin, bringing their cheese-making traditions with them. These storied skills, combined with the freshest milk available, created a cheese-making culture that is uniquely Wisconsin. Wisconsin's 1,200 cheesemakers, many of whom are third and fourth generation, continue to pass on old world traditions while adopting modern innovations in cheese-making craftsmanship. Find your next favorite cheese at wisconsincheese.com.
Okay, so Tom, that was fascinating. I mean, learning that you've got these, but I mean, like literally, what do you have to incinerate these things, which in a way, we don't want to be incinerating more things, because I would imagine that releases some chemistry into the air, which we probably don't want either.
Correct, right? And yeah, and think about the RO, the reverse osmosis. Actually, there's less to incinerate. Rather, there is about 50% of the water that you treat with RO it's called rejected. It's called the rejectate because only the clean water passes through, and the remainder, the rejectate, is where all the pollutants concentrate. And that rejectate you have to get rid of.
Yeah.
And often that ends up injected into the ocean or into the wastewater treatment plants, which are really not designed to treat PFAS.
Wow. I mean, what an incredibly complex problem.
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of blown away. So let's move on. So given that we have PFAS everywhere in this country, including in our bodies, we're hoping for a federal response, but it seems like at the moment every state is going it alone. Is that accurate?
Yes. Yes and no. I mean, EPA has issued those primary drinking water regulations in April of 2023, so fairly recently, and it will take time for these regulations to be implemented into everyday's life, right? I mean, building water treatment plants or retrofitting them to meet the EPA criteria just will take a lot of time and a lot of money. And again, some states have already pushed in that direction, so they're ahead of the game and have installed some sort of filters to meet the state government, the state regulations. But in cases where those state government regulations are exceeded, they have to maybe add another filter. So it takes time, and I would say on the global level, we are looking pretty good. We are pretty proactive here in the US, which is good news.
Yeah, fantastic. But I'm thinking of like places like North Carolina, for example, where, the Chemours, a spin-off. Well, I think when the PFAS thing first caught my eye, it was actually about 10, 12 years ago, because Dow DuPont spun off a division of their company that was making Teflon, and it started to be called the Chemours or Chemours, Chemours. And it turned out that they had been dumping their industrial waste, including massive amounts of PFAS, into the Nusi River and another big major river in the Wilmington area. And that the entire population of Wilmington, North Carolina, had been placed at risk for, intense PFAS contamination. My nephew was going to school there, so of course I was interested in that, and that's what got me interested in PFAS in general. And it is fascinating to me how much this story has accelerated, in the intervening years. Like you sort of didn't hear, I heard about that, kept that in the back of my mind, and then 10 years later, all of a sudden, I'm seeing it everywhere. So, I mean, fascinating. Now, what would you advocate for in terms of, as a scientist, what do we need a federal response? Because I know that the reason that North Carolina didn't say anything to the Chemours plant is because they want the plant in their area because it generates jobs and money.
Yeah, so this is nothing new when it comes to contamination. Again, let's go back 40 years.
Okay.
Gas stations.
Right.
Everybody wants a gas station on their block. And if you look today, there aren't that many gas stations left because many of these gas stations have been taken off the market because of the contaminations they caused to the local groundwater.
Right.
Go ahead 10 years to the 80s, 90s, everybody was talking about chlorinated solvents. Again, large quantities of chlorinated solvents used for all kinds of chemical processes, pollution everywhere.
Yeah.
So all of that required a response from the federal government. And one response, of course, is the Safe Clean Drinking Water Act that EPA issued. And based on that, the Superfund law and all these many, many laws, which basically put the government in charge of the most contaminated sites.
Right.
These are basically sites that are technologically so complex and or so expensive to clean up that the people or persons or companies that cause the pollutions are out of business, bankrupt, can't pay for it.
Right.
And instead of just letting it go, the government has to take over. And then the Superfund law has cleaned up many of these gasoline station sites, many of these chlorinated solvent sites, and so on and so on. And this is what we're seeing right now is the government taking over some of these very, very dramatic sites, like the ones you referenced to. So I'm seeing the government is responding, but like with most things, government, it takes time.
Yeah.
First, there need to be laws. That's the step number one. And then once the laws are implemented, we need the money to do all this work. And then it can take seriously decades. So we still, for example, still dealing with many chlorinated sites that are in active remediation since the late 80s.
Wow.
So 40 years later, still going on.
40 years. Oh my God.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
And I'm afraid we're looking at a similar time frame when it comes to PFAS, maybe even longer.
Yeah. Well, they are forever chemicals.
Exactly.
Right? So I noticed, I want to move on a little bit just to kind of draw the conversation out to a bigger lens, which is when we talk about, okay, you're saying the United States is kind of a global leader in trying to manage our PFAS contamination. Are other countries, I'd say mostly obviously in the developed world where there is funding for this, are they, like in Western Europe, for example, are they following suit? Are they ahead of us? Are they behind us? Do they have lessons for us? Are we trading information? How's that working out?
Yeah, there are definitely, just to mention, the European Union has a directive for drinking water, has defined standards which are quite higher actually than our standards. I would say at least about 100 times higher.
Oh my God. Okay.
Right? The government of Australia has been very active. Their standards are somewhat higher than ours. So besides the European countries and Australia and the US, I think again on the global level, these are the leaders in PFAS research, and of these, US I would say is most advanced. In other parts of the world, Africa, Asia, PFAS is not really on the forefront of people's minds. And a large part of it is lack of data.
Yeah.
Means it's there, but if nobody knows, nobody cares.
But in a country that is not so industrialized as the developed world, Western Europe, the United States, et cetera, North America, I guess I should say, I mean, is the PFAS contamination likely to be as significant as it is in more industrialized nations? No, right?
I would say yes, simply because of the fact that we outsourced most of our dirty industries to all parts of the world, right?
Oh, right.
I mean, for years we have manufactured in China. Now China is politically or economically not so attractive anymore. So we go to India, we go to Vietnam, we're going to Africa. And much what happens there is not happening in the same legal framework, let's say, that would be expected here at home. So you get away with stuff.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Just as they get away with, abuses, labor abuse, animal abuse. I mean, I mean, there's a reason why we send it to those countries, right?
And that's the price we, as a society, are willing to pay for having cleaned up our environment. We're not using industrial products anymore, but many of these products have been outsourced.
Mm-hmm.
And some of it comes back now to the US, but at least here at home, we have stringent environmental standards. So we're not repeating the same mistakes that are now happening outside the US.
But we don't seem to mind letting them repeat those mistakes. That's the thing.
Exactly.
And it's interesting to me because it totally parallels the way we have exported our food system around the world, and most particularly animal agriculture, which happens to be a particular focus of mine. But, we've made terrible mistakes in the way that we develop cheap meat for this country and now for the rest of the world. And every other country has adopted many of the same protocols, the concentrated animal feeding operation, the heavy use of antibiotics in the food supply and all of that stuff. We have taught everyone how to do that. And now they're all doing it with enthusiasm because they too want super cheap meat. but the sort of the environmental impacts of that system do not seem to have penetrated the consciousness of these new and developing nations that are really ramping up, say, their animal agricultural industry. I mean, it's really very troubling.
It's a tug of war between, on the one hand, the population of Earth is rapidly growing, the demand
Yes.
for food is increasing rapidly. So there is definitely an urgency on meeting the needs of food for all the people. And the Green Revolution was the beginning. And like I said, we have made many mistakes. During the process, we have also made many advances. And basically, hunger is not as much an issue anymore as it was 10, 20, 30 years ago on the global scale. So this is certainly part of the advancements that modern agriculture can be applauded for. But again, with many things, we only know understanding what are the environmental consequences and the price to society that these new technologies in agriculture, the use of fertilizer, pesticides, and whatnot, is costing us.
Right.
And again, here in the US, we have learned this lesson tragically, but by outsourcing the dirty work to other countries, same argument as I made before. It's still happening, but it's not regulated by our stringent standards, but by the local standards in countries where maybe standards don't even exist.
Yeah.
So
Or you have a government that is utterly corrupt.
Or that.
That is willing to take that hit because they want the money.
Correct.
And
corruption, that's certainly one driver of all this. And I must say, from my many travels in around the world, the young generations, the young people in India, in other countries, are very much aware of this. And they requesting change, they're demanding change. They're now sophisticated enough to tell their government, hey, you guys violating whatever rules are on the book, environmental rules. Stop doing that. They're demanding change, and they're seeing change. So I'm very hopeful that we indeed, on the global scale, waking up to the fact that current ways of conducting business are not necessarily the most environmental friendly ways, and there must be consequences for those who violate laws or those who are corrupt and looking out for their personal benefit only.
Right. You know, Tom, I think I wanted to go on and on with you about sort of the agrochem and dead zones, but we're gonna have to have another show about that.
You know where to find me.
Yeah, I do, and I'm so happy I have found you. I mean, that was so informative and interesting to me. I hope everybody else thought so, but being a bit of a geeky, nerdy type of a person, I really dug that whole conversation. So we'll be in touch to come back, and you'll talk about the work that you do cleaning river water in some of these other countries, and whether or not those techniques could be theoretically applied to some of our rivers that are so heavily polluted with agrochemicals and PFAS.
Correct.
You know, there's a lot to examine here. So I thank you so much for joining me today. Thanks as always to my sponsor for making this show possible and for supporting our podcasting platform at Heritage Radio Network. And Tom, we'll be in touch. We'll have you back soon. Thanks
for having me, and I truly enjoyed the conversation we had.
Fantastic. It's great to have a resource like you available to me. I appreciate it. And also, I just want to say one more thing, is that only an educator would be able to say the young people are waking up, because you're truly on that front line. And you see these kids, and I'm a crusty old cynic. You know, I don't believe in anything or anyone.
No. I mean, you have to draw your hope from somewhere, and there's really reason. And I'm optimistic that we will be seeing change.
That's a beautiful sentiment.
It takes time and a lot of money, but it's also opportunity for those young people.
Yes, it is. That's right. These are whole new industries that could be springing up just doing that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think if they understand that, then their outlook into the future will be changed in a positive way.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for this time. And thanks to everybody who tunes in to this show. And we'll see you next time. Thanks a million.
Bye-bye.
What Doesn't Kill You, Food Industry Insights, is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe.